The commander of the adventurer squad called Glen over, informing him that he was being removed from the team. Despite Glen's skills as a fighter, the commander made it clear that they had found a more worthy replacement. Glen wasn't entirely shocked by this announcement. He had long suspected the squad was preparing to get rid of him, and the timing made it even clearer. Just as the entire squad reached B rank, they'd decided it was time for him to go. Most likely, this new recruit had been carefully chosen for a while, waiting for the right moment to step in. Glen didn't argue. There was no point. Bro really just gave up. He had no interest in staying with a group of people who lacked loyalty. Instead, he listened as the commander offered him a gesture of goodwill, allowing him to keep all of his equipment as a memento for his service. It was a laughable offer. Every piece of gear Glen owned, he had earned through his own hard work and money. There was no sense in accepting something that wasn't rightfully his. Then Glen asked if he could speak to the newcomer, the one who would be replacing him. After a brief moment of hesitation, the commander agreed, allowing him a chance to officially pass on his position. The new recruit, Ruth, seemed somewhat familiar with Glen's reputation as a fighter, but it didn't make much difference to Glen. Instead of engaging in any lengthy conversation about his past or his skills, Glen simply offered a piece of advice. He told Ruth to get some earplugs. You'll thank him later. The newcomer was puzzled. Glen wasn't surprised because most people wouldn't understand right away. He could see the confusion on Ruda's face as he wondered why earplugs would be necessary, but he didn't explain just yet. Instead, Glen moved on to something else. He knew that rumors about him had circulated, particularly his trips to the brothel, and Ruta eventually brought it up. Glen wasn't offended. In fact, he had expected it. But what Ruta didn't know was the real reason behind those rumors. Glen explained that wherever they went, the squad became a little in heat. Yes, like feral cats who haven't been neutered. And when the squad leader got involved with his 3 favorite women, the noise escalated in that little tent of his. The only way to block out the madness was to wear earplugs. On top of everything, Glen adds that the group is just pure problematic. The squad leader, dissatisfied with the long conversation between Glen and the newcomer, urged them to finish quickly. Glen had no interest in lingering any longer with these people. He was already done. He wished the rookie good luck. Then the commander officially expelled him from the team. Glen grinned smugly, promising to cross paths with them again as he walked away. As he left, a strange sense of relief washed over him. Being removed from the team felt like a weight lifting. He'd been friends with these adventurers since childhood, but now that chapter was closed. He briefly thought about the money he'd often sent home and decided to check in on things. Finding a creaky wagon, Glen set off, gazing at the trees as he thought about how strange it was. His former team had reached B rank while he held an A rank. Still, he told the guild to be quiet about it. Just then, Glen snaps out of this thought, noting that it's hopeless to dwell on it. Glen then asked the driver how long the journey would take, and the coachman replied that it would take several days. The constant creaking of the old carriage and the hours of sitting in one spot made the journey feel endless. But eventually, Glen reached his destination. He finds himself in front of an orphanage, and outside of it is a priest. The priest is surrounded by many children, making Glen comment that he took on more responsibility. However, instead of being greeted warmly, the priest quickly demanded he leave. Rumors about him had spread, and his presence was a risk to the children. Glen was stunned. His anger flared, and in a fit of rage, he threw a coin purse at the priest, swearing never to return. Glen claimed that this would be the last time he'd ever step foot in the orphanage. He also swears that he'll never give them money ever again. He stormed off into the forest, cussing as he went. He even got so furious that he sliced a rhinoceros in half. Bro needs some therapy. As his anger consumed him, the words of the priest echoed in his mind. Suddenly, a jolt of pain shot through his hands and he fell to his knees, overcome by the intensity. The pain spiraled into his head, each second feeling like it might break him. He recalled the years of humiliation, the mocking, the name-calling he had to endure since childhood. It had all built up, and now it was too much. As a kid, Glen had been bullied a lot. The years passed, and Glen concluded that he was different from others, which was why he had no friends. Determined to change, he turned to books, an abundance of them in the orphanage. His first study material, a book about mental magic, introduced him to a shocking discovery. Lightning magic could be used to alter a person's character and memories. Intrigued and desperate, Glen decided to test this theory on himself. He used lightning bolts, directing them into his hands and pressing them to his head. Seriously, get this kid some help. At first, the results were subtle but noticeable. His transformation was evident, and even the nuns at the orphanage noticed how he no longer cried. Glen, now proud of his emotional control, claimed that he never cried. However, his journey took an unexpected turn when he found himself unconscious in a forest clearing. He was discovered by local fairies who debated what to do with him. A monster could be nearby, so they couldn't leave him in his weakened state. Just then, the fairy chief arrived and took charge of the situation. She reassured her subordinates and examined Glen, quickly realizing he had pushed his magic too far. Just then, the fairy chief remembered the first time she met Glen when he was a child. He marveled at her delicate wings, which made her blush. Seeing him in this state pained the fairy chief. His mind was damaged and his eyes visibly strained from the magic he performed. She and the other fairies, who had long cared for him, couldn't let him die. With no hesitation, she used her healing magic, determined to restore his strength. The spell worked and Glen eventually regained consciousness. Disoriented, he found himself in a soft bed, realizing he was in an unfamiliar place. The fairies, though relieved, hesitated to approach him. As Glen took in his surroundings, memories of his past encounters with fairies surfaced, fragments he had once tried to erase. Sensing his confusion, the fairy chief introduced herself as Freyna and encouraged him to look around. But Glen's mind was clouded and he struggled to grasp the situation. He ended up thinking he was in a brothel, but Freyna reassured him that he was not. Can't blame the man. That chick's pointy ears are hinting at some freaky stuff. As Freyna spoke, she revealed something deeper. She and Glen had known each other for a long time. To prove it, she shifted into the appearance she once had in the past. Recognition dawned on Glen, and he remembered her now. She was the same fairy he had met as a child in the garden. Freyna then revealed what she had kept hidden all these years. The moment she saw him back then, she had fallen in love with him, and had secretly formed a magical contract, vowing to watch over him. She recalled being enchanted by his bright eyes and innocent face, a memory that had never faded. Embarrassed by Freyna's sudden confession, Glen covered his face while he turned red. He then asked where he was, and Freyna advised him to look outside. She explained that he was in the realm of the fairies, and he was the first human ever to step into this place. Glen was surprised, having always thought of the fairy realm as nothing more than a myth. Just then, Freyna apologized for interfering in his fate, but she couldn't let him die in the forest. Freyna explained that even if he had survived, he could have been left crippled. She added that she had to fiddle with his eyes too. Only now, looking into a mirror, did Glen realize his eye color had completely changed. Freyna told him that this was her gift, the fairy eye. You thought long and hard for that one, huh? Confused by the revelation, Freyna explained that her gift is a type of magical vision. Glen was curious about their abilities, and Freyna confirmed that these eyes granted several powers. The Eye of Movement allowed teleportation to any location. The Eye of Appraisal could analyze materials, abilities, and even detect illnesses. There was also the Eye of Farseeing and the Eye of Foresight. Glen, overwhelmed, asked her to slow down, as he couldn't memorize everything at once. Freyna couldn't give a single flying F though, and she added that her gift also allowed Glen to use her very own powers. Hearing all this seemed too good to be true, so Glen asked for the catch. Freyna simply smiled at him, revealing that there was no catch and that she just did it for his sake. Bro, you gotta wife her up like right now. However, Freyna assured him that although the abilities were real, he would need training to use them properly. Glen understood his new fate, and he thanked her for the magical gift. Out of nowhere, he flashed a mix of a dashing and weird smile, making Freyna swoon and pass out. Seeing the effects of his killer smile, one of the smaller fairies explained that he should be careful with it. Other fairies, feeling left out, demanded his attention as well, wanting to have him for themselves. They reassured Glen that Freyna had fainted before for the same reason, and would be fine. Days later, Freyna began training Glen in using his new abilities. His first time wasn't the most exciting because he didn't use the eye's power properly, causing a massive explosion. Freyna, noticing his fatigue, wondered if she was pushing him too hard, but Glen refused to give up. He insisted that she watch as he demonstrated everything he had learned. By the end of the grueling day, Glen needed to relax. He decided to take a nice bath, but he was caught off guard when Freyna joined him. Of course, what's a bath scene without a bear mommy milker hovering over the MC? Freyna asked if he had gotten used to his new eyes, and Glen admitted that he was still surprised by their striking green color. When Freyna asked if he disliked them because they looked like hers, he quickly reassured her that he actually found them beautiful. Freyna, flustered, hides her tomato-like face under the water. Moments later, more fairies arrived, making Glen realize the area was becoming too crowded. Freyna explained that these fairies had sensed his mana, and they were attracted to it. Curious, Glen asked why they were suddenly so attached to him, and Freyna explained that it was because of the quality of his mana. Whenever the little fairies help him, they will receive his mana in return. Freyna then revealed that Glen had formed more contracts with fairies than anyone in the world. Glen was surprised by this, feeling uncomfortable with the excessive attention from the fairies. Even Freyna had not expected such a strong effect. She reasoned that her contract with him must have been too powerful, causing this unexpected outcome. Embarrassed, she insisted that it wasn't her fault, but Glen didn't understand what she meant. As she flustered, she suddenly demanded that he stop looking at her so intently, unable to handle his gaze. Glen promised not to, but he also asked her to release him immediately, as her embrace was becoming a little too tight. After taking a cold bath, Glen began to feel unwell and started sneezing. Freyna apologized, but he admitted that he was at fault as well. He shouldn't have soaked his little peener for that long. Feeling guilty, Freyna promised to bring him fresh fruit to help him recover. Glen, realizing how long it had been since he last fell ill, remembered his childhood and how weak he used to be. The nuns had often worried about his health, but Sister Arya had been the most caring. Thinking about her kindness brought a sense of warmth. But then Glen recalled his expulsion from the church. He hadn't seen Sister Arya that day and dreaded the thought that she too might have believed the rumors about him. Freyna later returned and found Glen asleep. The next morning he woke up feeling fully recovered and eager to resume training. Training began immediately, focusing on improving his ability to track movement, an essential skill for evading deadly attacks. He showed remarkable improvement, dodging all of Freyna's magical attacks with ease. Freyna praised him, noting that he had unlocked his innate magical potential, which was likely why he adapted so quickly. However, Freyna soon grew quiet, lost in thought. Sensing her unease, Glen asked what was wrong. After a pause, she hesitantly asked when he planned to leave the fairy realm. The question caught him off guard because he had never even considered it. He admitted that while he was excited to test his new abilities in the outside world, he had everything he needed here. He had a room and a decent environment, but most importantly, he wasn't alone. He had Freyna by his side, and that was reason enough for him to stay. Good tactic, man. Suck up to the landlord. Freyna, overwhelmed with emotion, burst into tears and embraced him tightly. Once again, her grip became painful, and Glen had to plead with her to let go. She quickly apologized, but he reassured her that it was fine because he hadn't realized what was going on in her mind either. To lift her spirits, Glen suggested they continue training. He asked if they should start magic training, which he had prior experience of. Freyna then recalled that he was good at lightning magic since he was a child. Just then, Glen revealed that since arriving in the fairy realm, he had learned to control all elemental magic. Freyna explained that this was due to the power of the fairies. Because he had formed a magical contract, he could now use elemental abilities from those he had bonded with. Without hesitation, Freyna promised to help Glen master his powers completely. He was eager to see how far he could go and asked where they would begin. However, instead of hearing cool advice, Freyna simply explained that all he needed to do was ask for help. Well, that's lame. Glen is a bit confused, but he follows her instructions and uses his powers normally. He then asks the fairies to lend a hand, which they're more than happy to do. As Glen focused, a bolt of lightning shot from his hand, infused with the immense magic of the fairies. The energy surge was overwhelming, and he immediately realized that such power must come at a cost. Freyna confirmed his concerns. She warned him that in the human world, such abilities would attract envy. Many would resent his power, and envy often led people to cause trouble. As a result, she strongly advised him never to interact with fairies in the human world. In other words, he would have to be a loner again. Womp, womp. This thought brought back painful memories of childhood, being ignored, excluded, and left to watch others play while he stood alone. He didn't want to experience that isolation again. Knowing this, he vowed to never cut the fairies off once he left the realm. If anyone tried to harm them, he would fight without hesitation. Then, out of nowhere, Glen urgently told Freyna that he had only 10 days left on his adventurer license, urging her to hasten his training. His realization that the world was full of scoundrels only strengthened his resolve. He needed to become stronger, not just for himself but to protect those he cared about. Hearing this, Freyna fully supported his determination and wasted no time in continuing their training. Finally, their training resumed, which focused on accuracy. Glen had to hit as many targets as possible without missing. He was confident, and in just a few minutes every target had been struck. His rapid improvement impressed Freyna, who praised him as a top-class magic knight. Encouraged by his progress, Glen asked for a greater challenge. Freyna decided to test his limits, significantly increasing the speed until Glen gave up. However, Glen met every challenge head-on. He had destroyed countless targets, leaving Freyna exhausted. She knelt to the ground, admitting she had underestimated his ability. However, Glen merely credited his success to Freyna because she helped him get used to the eye. Despite the productive training, Glen was beginning to feel exhausted. Freyna, however, revealed that they were only warming up. Welp, for the next stage, they needed the help of the smaller fairies. A swarm of tiny balls of light suddenly appeared behind Glen, their voices murmuring excitedly. Freyna explained that the next lesson was about establishing a deeper magical connection with the fairies. Glen had never attempted such a thing before, making this an entirely new challenge. To begin, Freyna asked him to connect with her first, after which she would transfer her mana to him. As he took her hands, a surge of magic flowed through him, but it was too subtle and he couldn't feel it. Frustrated, Glen pulled away, feeling as though he wasn't making any progress. However, Freyna remained positive and encouraged him to try again. They clasped hands once more, and this time she instructed him to close his eyes and focus, not just on the magic, but on his acceptance of the fairies. Glen concentrated deeply, manifesting in his mind that he wanted to stay with the fairies forever. Just then, their hands glowed from the surge of powerful mana. At last, the connection was formed. Magic flowed through him in waves, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. Seeing this, Freyna congratulated him on successfully establishing a magical bond. Overwhelmed by the sheer power within him, Glen boasted that he now felt strong enough to take on a dragon. Freyna laughed, stating that he could even push his abilities further. After a long day of training, Glen and Freyna decided to relax in a warm bath. Instead of hovering over Glen like she usually does, Freyna remained unusually deep in thought. Curious, Glen asked what was troubling her. She confessed that she didn't understand why he had struggled so much to connect with her when it had been easier with the other fairies. Glen reassured her that it was because she was the first. She had taught him everything, and that made the connection different. Freyna immediately relaxed, feeling reassured. Bro's a manipulative mastermind. Glen, now feeling a surge of strength, acknowledged how easy it had become to wield fairy magic. It didn't even have any drawbacks. However, Freyna reminded him that he would be sought out because of his capabilities. Despite that, she was confident that he could beat them all up. Glen wasn't sure how to respond. He knew that even with his power, facing such an enemy wouldn't be easy. Freyna, however, made one thing clear. He was not alone. His enemies were now enemies of the fairies, and they would never abandon him. Glen had always fought alone, but now, he realized he had an entire army of fairies with him. Literally, they're following him 24/7. Still, he thought that it would be better if battles were fought only against monsters, not humans. Freyna agreed, especially if he fought a giant dragon. The next day, Glen and Freyna decided to train through a duel. Both were confident in their abilities, and the smaller fairies excitedly gathered to watch. As they prepared for battle, each determined not to hold back, they launched their attacks at the exact same moment. When their spells collided in the middle, a burst of energy filled the air, canceling each other out. Freyna, impressed by Glen's skill, decided to let the battle continue. She was impressed by Glen's progress, and she even called him a ferocious monster, not just a mediocre magic knight. The air between them was thick with energy, and she was eager to see what Glen could do next. Just then, Glen went in for a decisive strike, and this time his magic hit with even greater force. Freyna, powerful as she was, couldn't hold up against it. She was sent flying back, unable to stand against Glen's strength. Glen couldn't hide his joy. He'd finally beaten the fairy chief, something he'd long hoped for. But Freyna wasn't happy. She was frustrated, maybe even angry. Glen noticed her mood shift and tried to calm her down, but Freyna couldn't hide her emotions. Deciding to shift the conversation, Glen reminded her of something she'd said before, that she had been watching him since he was a kid. Glen suddenly clarified that he doesn't feel those intimate feelings with Freyna. Suddenly, Freyna gazed in his direction, claiming that she was well aware, but it still hurt regardless. She knew he used lightning magic to treat himself, but it was excessive, turning his suffering into greed. Despite that, Freyna managed to understand that he did it to stop himself from breaking. Glen understood that he was reckless, and he swore never to do it again. He had friends to reside on now, which Freyna agreed is true. Later that day, Glen asked Freyna about the seasons, curious how time worked in this magical world. Freyna revealed that they don't have 4 seasons as the human world does, as she's capable of controlling it for everyone's comfort. Hearing this, Glen asked what season it was outside, and Freyna answered that winter was almost over. Recalling that he entered the fairy realm in early spring, Glen realized that he had stayed there for almost a year. Just then, Freyna reminded him that his adventurer's card was nearing expiration. Freyna saw it as the perfect time to address an important issue. Who would accompany Glen back to the human world? According to her, fairies always follow those they've made magical contracts with. However, here comes the problem. He had made contracts with countless fairies. Can you blame the man for having game? He didn't understand why he had to choose. After all, the fairies liked him and had made contracts with him willingly. That being said, he didn't want to leave any of them behind. However, Freyna warned that taking too many would cause trouble in the human world, but Glen retorted that he trained for that exact reason. What mattered most was finding a way to keep the fairies hidden from outsiders. Touched by his kind heart, Freyna lunged towards Glen, suffocating him with her strong biceps. While Freyna bawled her eyes out, Glen noticed that the small fairies had been crying along with her. After their little moment, Glen asked how they'd managed with so many little fairies. Freyna revealed that her kind could turn invisible without even using magic. Just then, she demonstrated it by disappearing in a snap. Glen was amazed, but Freyna quickly pointed out that other fairies would still be visible to anyone who had a magical contract with them. However, Glen wasn't too worried. He knew his unusual eye color would probably give away his connection to the fairies. But for him, the most important thing was that they could all live together happily, no matter the challenges ahead. Freyna smiled as she heard this, and she agreed with everything he said. Suddenly, she reminded Glen that she had to make preparations for their journey. Freyna took no chances in securing the fairy realm. She set up powerful magical traps along the borders, ensuring that no intruders could enter their world undetected. These barriers would stop any enemy that dared to cross into their domain. Speaking of enemies, Freyna turned to Glen, asking how he felt about his former team and the people from the church. Without hesitation, he made his feelings clear. He didn't care for the people who abandoned him. Sensing the weight of his emotions, Freyna suggested he take a moment to unwind. A last bath together would help him relax before they continued their preparations. Glen smiled, agreeing with Freyna's proposal. Meanwhile, in the human world, a girl named Flora refused to give up the search for Glen. Flora was relentless, demanding updates and pressing her assistants for results. Glen's disappearance was not just a personal concern, it was tied to the very existence of her company, Renava. Her urgency was clear, but her assistant urged her to stay calm, reminding her that when it came to Glen, she wasn't herself. And the love triangle thickens. Flora, however, was too invested to slow down now. She ordered a full report on the investigation. Her assistant laid out the known details: Glen's expulsion from his adventurers team, his visit to the church where he grew up, and then nothing. After that, his movements became a mystery. No one knew where he had gone. Flora, deep in thought, began to piece things together. If Glen had done exactly what she suspected, his strange behavior could have been explained by the rumors that had spread about him. If that was the case, she should have done more to rehabilitate his image. However, Flora's assistant interjected, claiming that it wouldn't have made a difference. Glen had always been the glue that held his adventuring team together. But now, everything was falling apart. The team had suffered multiple defeats, and the members had started to point fingers. They blamed the newcomer, the very person who had once been their anchor. Rookie got scammed, for real. Flora, on the other hand, was entertained by the story, flashing an evil look that scared her assistant. Just then, she stood from her seat and she told her assistant to keep investigating. After she left, the assistant buried his face in his palms, wondering where Glen had disappeared. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Flora's office. A young woman introduced herself as Maria Beyrun, the youngest daughter of Count Beyrun. She wasted no time explaining the reason for her visit. She had come to find out what had happened to Glen. Flora's mind immediately connected the dots. Glen had spoken of Maria before, often mentioning her as the one who had taught him so much, especially when it came to navigating the complex world of documents and languages. After a quick exchange of pleasantries, Maria cut straight to the chase. She was worried about Glen and she wanted to know everything regarding his disappearance. Flora, sensing Maria's domineering vibe, immediately explained what happened. After hearing the whole story, Maria's face grew concerned and her once intimidating aura faded away. Just then, Flora asked Maria if she believed the rumors about Glen, but she confidently answered that she didn't. She knew him best, but it's undeniable that the capital changed him a lot. Flora then asked if Maria had met with Glen before his disappearance, and she confirmed it. She also mentioned that Glen's previous party faced some major issues, even though they came from the same church. A new recruit had joined Glen's old party, only to leave within a month. Whispers of Glen's alleged intimate abuse also circulated, but Maria believed that the leader had created those stories. Alain was more sociable than Glen, but the man's relationship with the church was going downhill. Maria then revealed another shocking truth. The money Glen had been sending home for years had been embezzled by the church. The funds meant for the donations had been stolen, and now the person in charge was in prison. Flora, recalling how much Glen had personally sacrificed, realized that he had been doing it all for the church and the children who depended on it. That was why Maria had come to Flora's company, to find out what had happened to Glen. She cared about him deeply and was determined to uncover the truth. Flora, pausing to take in everything, asked if Maria was struggling with anything at the moment. Despite her confusion, Maria said that food, clothing, and bedding were scarce. Hearing this, Flora carefully noted the situation and promised to find a way to help, making it clear that she didn't want Glen to ever think her company had abandoned his family. Maria's eyes gleamed and she thanked Flora for her kindness. Elsewhere, Glen and Freyna reappeared in the human world, their journey made seamless thanks to the Eye of Movement. The young adventurer took a deep breath, realizing just how long it had been since he last came to the capital. Meanwhile, Freyna kept hovering over him, insisting that her gift made their travel effortless. At the entrance to the capital, a large crowd had gathered, eager to enter. Glen quickly assessed the situation and determined that they were just ordinary travelers. Rather than wait in line, he adjusted his course and headed toward his first priority, the Adventurers Guild. His ranked adventurer card was nearing expiration, and renewing it was necessary before anything else. Upon entering the guild, Glen's presence immediately caused a stir. His disappearance had been a huge deal, and Flora's assistant was visibly shocked to see him return. News traveled fast, and the assistant, Ludger, wasted no time in reporting Glen's return to Flora. Flora wondered what the fuss was about, but before she could ask for details, Ludger simply gestured toward the entrance, revealing Glen standing there in the flesh. Both Flora and Ludger were stunned. Without hesitation, they rushed toward him with an embrace, but Glen had no interest in dramatic reunions. With a quick use of the Eye of Movement, he teleported away from them, keeping his distance. Flora and Ledger were surprised, not just by Glen's rejection of the sappy moment, but by the way he had moved. They also failed to notice the most significant change, his new eyes. Glen, on the other hand, was slightly pissed at them for asking questions when they didn't give him a chance to talk. After hearing his story, Flora was left in shock. Glen had been in the fairy world all this time. To prove his claim, Glen asked Freyna to reveal herself. The fairy chief instantly became visible, introducing herself with grace. Flora and Ledger were astonished, finally realizing why Glen was impossible to find. Flora, still trying to piece things together, asked if teleportation was one of the Fairy Eye's powers. Glen confirmed this but explained that his new abilities extended far beyond simple teleportation. However, Ledger interjects, reminding Glen that revealing such knowledge could put him in danger. Glen acknowledged the risk, but he explained that Flora and Ledger had always supported him in the past, and for that, he was willing to share the truth. Flora admitted that she had never expected to hear such words from Glen. But before the conversation could go any further, the doors suddenly swung open. Standing at the entrance was Maria, tears already welling in her eyes. She had feared the worst, but now, seeing Glen alive and well in the capital, the relief overwhelmed her. Curious about Mary's sudden arrival, Glen asked how she had ended up at Flora's office. Flora dismissed it as a long story, but it didn't take long before the conversation turned to more pressing matters. Glen, now focused, asked for clarity about the church's corruption. He had heard whispers of it before, but now he needed the truth. Was the embezzlement just the beginning? Flora confirmed his suspicions, revealing that stealing money was only one of many crimes that had come to light. Shifting gears, Glen then asked about Alain and the rest of his former team. Just then, Flora pulled out several thick folders and placed them before him. These were detailed records of his former team's activities, carefully compiled to track their movements. Stalker much? As Glen flipped through the documents, the truth became apparent. The team was in shambles. Their progress had declined significantly, and even the materials they had been supplying to the Adventurers Guild had dropped in quality. The group's rank had plummeted from C to D, and the newcomer Ruth had already left them. I'm guessing the earplugs weren't enough. Confused by Flora's meticulous tracking, Glen asked why she was gathering so much information about his old team. Flora explained that this was part of an ongoing investigation into their possible involvement in the church's crimes. Glen then recounted a moment from the past, a time when he had seen a suspicious figure meeting with Alain in secret. They met at the Labyrinth without the party knowing. Glen had attempted to follow the man but never found out what was happening. Ledger, deep in thought, agreed that a labyrinth was the perfect place for secret dealings. Glen went on to describe a strange pendant the man had been wearing, a sword entwined with a snake. Flora immediately flipped through her notes, finding an exact match in one of her records. The symbol was known to be associated with a famous group, but little was known about it. However, one thing was now certain. Whoever these people were, they were directly linked to the crimes of the adventurer team. Maria praised Glen for his sharp observation, while Ledger thanked him because they had moved one step closer to uncovering the truth. He then congratulated Glen on his return, which made the man smile. After the short meeting, Glen told Freyna that he would go all out on his earnings the next day. He asked her if she and the other fairies would accompany him, and Freyna gladly affirmed it. The little fairies then whispered in Glen's ear, telling him that they wouldn't miss it for the world. Glen explained their objective: to hunt monsters, harvest their materials, and sell them for profit. Freyna, now grasping the full purpose of their adventure, realized that this was how Glen earned money. The next day, they ventured deeper into the labyrinth. Freyna's attention was drawn to strange glowing patches on the walls, so Glen quickly explained that it was a type of special moss that naturally illuminated the confined space. It was a useful feature, especially for adventurers. Glen also took the opportunity to gather valuable ore and herbs along the way, explaining that these too could be sold for a decent price. However, he suddenly sensed danger. He quickly warned Freyna of a pack of approaching orcs, their massive figures emerging from the shadows. He explained that they had to keep the bodies intact or they wouldn't be able to sell them. Freyna, assessing the situation, immediately came up with a strategy. Water magic would be the perfect way to eliminate them without damaging their bodies. She quickly issued her command, and the little fairies, eager to prove themselves, pledged to carry it out flawlessly. In an instant, a powerful surge of water magic crashed down upon the pack of orcs. The monsters had no time to react. The force of the spell overwhelmed them completely. Within moments, the entire group had been wiped out, their bodies left intact just as Glen had hoped. Motivated by the fairies' skills, Glen decided to demonstrate his own newfound abilities. With ease, he destroyed several horned wolves, killing them all with a series of slashes. Soon after, Glen inspected their loot, and he felt confident that the rewards would be hefty. Meanwhile, in a different part of the world, Alain was frustrated and tired for earning an insignificant amount of money. He looked at the small amount of money he had earned, realizing that wasn't enough to even cover a night's rest at the inn. One of the girls from his team spoke up, noting that Alain hasn't been doing well as the only vanguard. He's way too tired for the task, and it didn't help that nobody was interested in their recruitment notice. Another girl from the team agreed, and she speculated that Ruth spread some rumors about them. The first girl curled her palm into a fist, furious that Ruth left the team when he had only joined for a month. On top of that, Glen went missing. Just then, Alain flashed a dashing look at the girl, whose name was Emily, and he told her to calm down because it would put her cute face to waste. Alain suddenly embraced Emily, explaining that what happened to Glen couldn't be helped. He simply became a lost cause after the team gave up on him. Alain, in a twisted sense of relief, was actually glad that Glen was now gone. Emily was in love with Glen, and with him out of the picture, he could now have Emily all to himself. Glen's got some serious face card to bag this many chicks. As he reflected on the past, Alain remembered the first time he met Glen at the church. Glen was a quiet, withdrawn child, not the type to make friends easily. But when Emily came into the picture, Alain seethed with jealousy. Emily seemed to pay more attention to Glen, even proclaiming that she would marry him someday. Emotional damage. At one point, they all grew up, and they were now allowed to leave the church and pursue their own paths. When the priest asked for their plans, Alain cheerfully answered that he wanted to become an adventurer with Glen, Emily, and the others. Glen, on the other hand, wasn't exactly aware of this plan, but he just went along with it. Unbeknownst to him, Alain only wanted to bring them to the outside world so he could tear them away from each other. And so Alain started to spread harmful rumors about Glen, telling others that he forced his way with women. This, in turn, affected the relationship between him and Emily. Once close, Emily had started distancing herself due to the accusations, and Glen, realizing the toll this had taken, felt increasingly isolated. As the issue got worse, Glen started to use lightning magic on himself to numb the pain. Ludger noticed Glen's emotional deterioration, so he advised him to leave the party. However, it seemed like Glen had already accepted his fate, claiming that adventurers are bound to die anyway. Maria, seeing the weight on Glen, tried to intervene by healing him, but she quickly realized that she couldn't do it completely. She then apologized for her inability to improve his emotional state before leaving. She really said never mind, then dipped. Unbeknownst to Maria, Glen actually felt better. However, his relief was short-lived, as he had to face reality once again. As time passed, Alain continued to spread the lies, making Glen's life harder. Eventually, he fired him, leaving him to fend for himself. Fast forward to the present, Alain found himself in a challenging situation. The team was falling apart, with no decent replacement for Glen, and no money coming in. However, after hearing about Glen's return to the capital, Alain saw an opportunity to confront him once again. In the capital, Glen enjoyed some of the food he had missed, but he soon realized he was the subject of gossip. Freyna, invisible as always, observed the attention he was receiving and found herself surprised by how much Glen was now the center of attention. Glen, however, is a tad bit relieved that the people's perception of him has improved. It wasn't long before he ran into Garius Silva, Saitama's medieval cousin. The clan leader of the Silver Knights. Glen was surprised to see the experienced adventurer who hadn't been in the capital for a long time. Garius was upset that Glen disappeared while he was gone, and now he believed Glen hated him. At the back of Glen's head, it's not entirely untrue. The bald man is a bit too intense sometimes. Just then, Garius mentioned that his clan mentioned Glen's return. However, Glen seemed uninterested in Garius' story, and he kept eating while listening to him babble. Garius called him out for it, but Glen bluntly replied that they had never really been close. Garius' smile suddenly turned upside down, and he mentioned how Glen kept on refusing his requests to join his clan. Just then, Freyna invited herself into the conversation, casually popping out of the void to wave hello to Garius. Garius is amazed by Freyna's sudden appearance, while Glen tries to play cool. Just then, Garius continued his relentless pursuit of inviting Glen, citing his obsession for Glen's power. Freyna, having overheard, weighed in on the situation. She had spoken with the little fairies and confirmed that the Silver Knights were a decent group. Still, Glen remained cautious, and after some thought, he agreed to cooperate under a short trial. Garius seemed pleased with this, but accepted that they would discuss the possibility further down the line. Later, Ludger caught up with Glen, reporting that the appraisal of the materials had been completed. Glen was impressed by how quickly it had been done, and Ludger explained that the veterans did it. Ludger was also shocked to know that Glen had a storage skill, and he wondered if he wanted to sell everything he had. Glen, flipping through the paperwork with ease, confirmed that he had no problem with it. He only scanned the documents for a few seconds, which surprised Ludger. Glen explained that his new eyes, thanks to Freyna's gift, allowed him to examine documents and resources in seconds, something that is better than any appraisal skills. Ludger acknowledged the usefulness of this ability, and as they parted ways, Ludger reminded Glen that he could reach out to him if anything came up. Soon, Glen and Garius were in the main office of the Silver Knights clan. Garius explained that his clan was composed of adventurers and craftsmen, and they were 50 in total. Garius loudly introduced Glen as an important guest who would be cooperating with the clan for a short trial run. When Glen's name was mentioned, many of the clan members grew quiet, some visibly processing their response. It was clear that the rumors surrounding Glen had already reached them. Glen, noticing the cold reception, asked Garius if any of the members would hate him for joining. Garius didn't deny that there would be some skeptical members, but before he could finish talking, some of the younger members suddenly gathered around Glen. With smiles, they claimed that they admired Glen for rising to an A rank on his own, which is every adventurer's dream. Glen was shocked to receive such warm words, and he realized that this was the first time that anyone looked at him like that. Garius chuckled at the situation, then he explained to Glen that his clan's motto was freedom. They don't force anyone to take tests, which Glen can attest is true. He heard about this fact from other people before he joined the clan. The clan's policies haven't changed, and Garius believed that this is one of their strong points. With this, Garius shook Glen's hand, informing him that the trial would last for a month. And just like that, Glen has become an unofficial member of the Silver Knights clan. It didn't take long for the news of their partnership to spread quickly, and many were shocked by this unexpected alliance. Glen noticed how fast rumors spread, but Garius advised him not to worry. Garius then explained that Glen's information was more valuable than gold, as Carol had been frantically collecting it. Glen was pissed that the little cat was still around, but Garius reminded him that not all the information Carol spread was bad. Some of it helped Glen's reputation as well. Changing the subject, Garius asked Glen to demonstrate his new magical abilities. Glen eagerly agreed, and soon he sensed two dangerous monsters nearby. Without hesitation, he unleashed a powerful energy blast, killing the monsters in a single motion. The members of the Silver Knights clan were stunned by the display of power, and many asked Garius if Glen's powers were even possible for a human to have. With a shocked look, Garius answered that this Glen was way more powerful than the one he met before. It was said that he was close to reaching S rank, and he's also a hard worker who trained a lot by himself. Garius believed that Glen honed his strength in the time that he hadn't seen him. Glen soon demonstrated his abilities, effortlessly controlling his powers. As a final display, he froze his opponent in an instant, and with a simple wave of his hand shattered them into ice chips. Unfazed, Glen asked Garius for his opinion on his skills. The latter is still processing Glen's strength, and he tells him to stop acting like he's normal. Man's gotta flex somehow. One of the girls, Rick, asked Glen if he used strengthening magic on his body. She claimed to use it as well, but Glen's technique seemed different than hers. Glen, recognizing her curiosity, agreed that it was similar, but clarified that his method was a bit different. He explained that his magic came from within his body, not externally like most others. To master this technique, one would need to understand the human anatomy, making it difficult to imitate. Rick, excited by the challenge, promised to master it and show Glen her progress. Motivated by his example, the rest of the younger members urged Glen to teach them his ways too. Garius looked at his members, asking if they now understood who Glen really was. He wanted to know if anyone still had doubts or disliked him, but the response was unanimous. Everyone in the room admired Glen. Satisfied with their answer, Garius declared the demonstration over and invited everyone to go home. However, Glen, sensing that something was off, decided to stay behind for a while. Once he was alone, he demanded Carol to reveal herself. The cheerful girl suddenly popped out of a nearby bush, praising his improved detection skills. She reminded him how long it had been since they last saw each other, but Glen, clearly uninterested in the encounter, referred to her as a shitty cat. Man's got zero filters. Carol, instantly annoyed, tried to karate kick him, but Glen blocked it and then grabbed her leg, lifting her off the ground. Carol demanded that he let go and stop calling her that, but Glen just teased her with a new nickname, Stray Cat. Eventually he released her, but Carol warned him to watch his words, claiming she was older than him. Glen wasn't interested in changing his behavior, at least not until she stopped stalking him. Out of nowhere, Carol suddenly starts meowing like a raging weirdo, which instantly creeped Glen out. He asked what was up, and Carol revealed that their little reunion just seemed surreal. Glen was the only person who could banter with her, and she was just glad to see him again. Despite Carol's warm welcome, Glen rudely turned his back on her, disregarding everything she just said. Furious, Carol demanded that he say he was back, but Glen simply replied that that would feel like losing. Just then, Glen asked if Carol had been tasked by the capital to follow him around. The little cat girl didn't even try to hide it, and she admitted that Glen had changed a lot, so much so that she had to gather information about him all over again. Suddenly, Glen demanded information from her about the capital, reminding her that she owed him for not revealing her presence to Garius. Carol tried to call him out for being so domineering, but Glen remained determined. He calmly pointed out that he knew all about how she had secretly infiltrated the clan and could easily report her to the guards. For the first time, Carol looked genuinely frightened. She pleaded with him not to do that, knowing full well the consequences. This cat got so stressed out she stopped saying "nya." Left with no choice, Carol confessed she had been involved in an undercover investigation recently. Then, as if to make things even more secretive, she switched to speaking in feline code. Glen was caught off guard because investigations and Carol rarely went together. Carol explained that this wasn't just any job. She had never worked for clients this powerful before, so she had given it her all. Glen quickly deduced that Queen Lysiana herself was likely behind it. Carol was impressed by his sharp intuition and made him an offer. If Glen helped with her investigation, she would pay for their dinner. Glen agreed, knowing he wasn't one to turn down free food. What surprised Carol, though, was how much he ordered. She admitted she hadn't expected him to eat that much. Girl missed the memo. Unapologetic, Glen explained that his stomach must have become bigger than last year. Just then, Glen flashed a serious look, recalling that Carol wanted to talk to him about something. After a moment of hesitation, Carol remarked that Glen had changed a lot since his time away from the capital. She suggested that perhaps he had even managed to heal his previously scarred brain. Glen was surprised she knew so much, and then he confirmed her suspicions. He had been cured. That's when Carol's eyes locked on his, the ones that had drawn her attention since they met. She pointed out that if his recovery was real, it could only mean one thing. He must have been cured by someone even stronger than the Saintess. Glen couldn't understand how the Saintess was relevant to the conversation, so Carol reminded him of the incident from long ago when a woman cast healing magic on him. Carol explained that it was the S-class adventurer named Tia Liulex, also known as the Saintess. Just then, Glen heard Frena's voice in his head, warning him that Carol was a crafty conversationalist who might soon lead him to reveal secrets about the fairy world. Glen had long figured that out himself and suggested they change the subject. Carol didn't argue and quickly made a small request. Glen sighed, hoping it wasn't something too outlandish, but Carol's request caught him off guard. She asked him to take on the responsibility of protecting the queen. Glen couldn't believe his ears at first. He asked if he had understood her correctly. Soon enough, he and Carol set off to meet the queen. However, the route they took puzzled Glen since it seemed to lead in a completely different direction from the royal castle. Carol explained that they had to use a secret passage in the heart of the capital to maintain the conspiracy. She then led Glen to an ordinary building that no one would ever suspect. Upon entering the building, Glen wondered why the royal guards weren't protecting the queen. Carol explained that the kingdom was going through tough times, but no one was aware of it yet. Just then, she pressed a hidden button, opening a secret passage. Glen was impressed by the clever design, and Carol revealed that the queen herself had come up with it. Carol smirked and explained that she had personally convinced the queen that Glen could be trusted. Minutes later, they were in a private room with Queen Lysiana. The queen greeted Carol warmly, clearly showing how close they were. Then she turned her attention to Glen, asking him who he was. With a nervous tone, Glen introduced himself. Carol then presented the queen to Glen, introducing her as Lysiana von Julian. Sensing Glen's nervous look, Carol suddenly pointed at him, teasing him for being too tense. Just then, Queen Lysiana placed her arms on Carol's shoulders, and she confirmed that the little cat girl was her trusted friend. Not long after, they decided to talk over some tea. Glen confessed he hadn't expected such a warm welcome since strange women were rarely friendly to him at first. The queen laughed, acknowledging that his bad reputation had contributed to that. However, she trusted Carol's judgment. Glen thought it was ironic since, in his eyes, Carol was the most devious and unreliable person he had ever met. Carol, offended, reminded him that they'd shared dinner and a nice walk through town. Lysiana burst out laughing, confessing it had been a long time since she laughed so heartily. Then the queen became serious, explaining her dire situation. The king had been poisoned, and though she had no hand in it, she was now under suspicion. Frena, listening carefully, believed the queen was telling the truth. Glen then asked Carol for more information, but she admitted that her investigation had hit a wall. Someone was very good at covering their tracks. Hearing this, Glen promised his full cooperation, assuring the queen that she could count on him. Lysiana was touched, asking if he was doing this for Carol's sake. Glen made it clear that his decision had nothing to do with Carol. Oof, apply ointment on the burnt area. He just wanted to help the queen because she trusted him. Lysiana blushed at his words, visibly touched by his kindness. Suddenly, Glen asked the queen to step aside. Confused but trusting him, she complied. Then, without hesitation, Glen launched a powerful attack at the chair where Lysiana had been sitting, and the furniture crumbled into pieces. From the remnants of the chair, Glen pulled out a masked man, nervous and afraid. The queen stared in shock, trying to recall where she had seen the stranger before. Glen demanded his identity, but the man only said that he was not a suspicious person. Right, because you weren't hiding inside a chair. Lysiana, furious, swiftly reminded the intruder that he wasn't given permission to speak. Just then, Glen instructed Carol to cover Lysiana's ears because things were about to get loud in his attempt to interrogate the man. Carol covered the queen's ears but also joked about who would cover hers. However, Glen remained serious and didn't reply. Instead, he bound the stranger with magical chains and sent lightning bolts of lightning through him, demanding answers. Someone give this guy a raise, and so the man endured the shocking agony before finally giving in. Carol and the queen asked if the man was still alive, and Glen answered that he was. He had no intention of killing the man as he was only trying to get answers out of him. Carol, clearly deaf from the man screaming, laid her head on a table, groaning that she never heard anyone that loud. Just then, Glen asked the man for his identity, and he replied that he was Delum Rubesta. Hearing this, Lysiana recalled that he was the eldest son of the first commander of the Order of Chivalry. Still dazed by the torture, Delum struggled to reveal the truth. However, Glen was able to deduce his secret surveillance of the queen, revealing a plot far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The former king was planning to dethrone Lysiana. Things are only getting worse. The isolated nature of her chambers meant that if anything happened, no one would know in time to save her. Carol stood frozen in horror at the thought while Freyna proposed a solution. The fairies would guard the queen, ensuring her safety in ways no human could. Glen, sensing an ulterior motive, teased Freyna about her fear of missing out. She blushed furiously, denying the accusation but not very convincingly. Trusting the fairies to protect Lysiana, Glen turned serious. He had a secret to share to Lysiana and Carol, one known only to a select few. Glen then revealed that his previous year away from the capital wasn't spent in ordinary travel, as he had lived in the magical world of fairies. Both Carol and Lysiana were speechless. Fairies were just stories told to children, or so they had thought. Yet here stood Freyna before them, the chief of fairies. Freyna introduced herself, and Lysiana returned the favor. Meanwhile, Carol was still in disbelief. Freyna chuckled, and she reassured the girls that they shouldn't be too tense because she believed that they were Glen's trusted friends. And so Queen Lysiana vowed to cooperate with Freyna and the fairies. Just then, Glen disclosed that he would leave the fairies he had contracted with as a guard. As for Delum Rubesta, Glen instructed Freyna to throw the man under the floorboards. With the plan in motion, Glen decided to leave the queen's chambers. He was unable to bid Carol goodbye as she was still dazed by everything that just happened. Before leaving, Glen reminded the little fairies to protect the queen. Then with a single snap, he vanished into thin air. With Glen gone, Lysiana remained positive, hoping that this would prove her innocence. Later on, Glen and Carol met up with Garius, revealing that they partied up together. Seeing his shocked reaction, Glen apologized for not being able to join clan activities when he just joined. Carol decided to chime in, adding that Glen got caught up in one of her shenanigans. Garius then teased Carol, claiming that Glen had become an unfortunate victim. Furious, Carol asked him what he meant. Just then, Garius turned serious, reassuring Glen that he would explain everything to the clan. For now, he just wanted Glen to do his best. However, before Glen left for good, Garius told him something important. That night, Glen and Carol secretly stayed in a nearby inn. There, Glen asked Carol if she noticed they were being followed, and she confirmed it. However, she disclosed that they were not the bad people Glen expected. They merely wanted information about Glen. Suddenly, Carol told Glen that she saw one of his ex-party members, Alain. Glen didn't notice him, but maybe that was because he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. Carol then teased Glen, claiming that his atmosphere changed so much that he became a little unnoticeable. Freyna suddenly popped out of nowhere, confirming that Glen now has a more charming aura compared to before. However, Carol jokingly added that his sharp tongue hadn't changed, but on the bright side, he's now easier to get along with. Meanwhile, Glen remained serious, deciding that they should assume they were being investigated by his ex-party at the moment. Freyna tried to calm him, reminding him that since he didn't want to return to his past life, it didn't really matter if they found him. However, Glen argued that they had no idea what plans those people might have for him, and it was unlikely that their intentions were anything good. Freyna could only sigh, praying that the situation resolved itself. Determined to gather more information, Glen set out for the Rubster family's home. There, Glen used disappearing magic for all of them, and Carol couldn't help but marvel at his magic. Freyna chuckled, commenting that even she couldn't perform magic like that. Just then, Glen noticed Dalm's study, so he suggested they go there. They quickly scanned the documents in the room, but they were forced to stop when Dalm suddenly entered the room. Unable to see them through their invisible state, Dalm was unaware that the three were peering into the document he was holding. Suddenly, someone called Dalm, informing him that breakfast was ready. When the man left, the three looked at each other and agreed to teleport to the capital's busy streets. There they talked about what they witnessed. What they read confirmed their worst fears. The paper revealed that the entire nobility was involved in a criminal conspiracy. Carol suggested that such devastating news would crush the queen's hope for salvation. Despite the gravity of the situation, Carol remained determined to uncover the truth. She proposed that they should investigate the home of the Minister of Justice, Duke Broudry Venide. Though confused by the name's involvement, Glen listened as Carol explained that the Broudry family had long been in conflict with the Queen. Hearing this, Glen sighed and exclaimed that the situation was nothing short of depressing. Even Carol was taken aback by the depth of the conspiracy, but she was relieved because, with Glen by her side, she felt confident they could handle it. Despite the challenge, Glen resolved to see the case through to the end. With a smile, Freyna also mentioned that she was there to back them up. Upon returning to the Queen, Glen presented the list of those involved in the plot against the royal family. The Queen read it carefully several times and questioned the accuracy of the information. Glen explained that he and the Fairies had double-checked everything for 3 days, and he was completely certain of its validity. The Queen was devastated, but Glen reassured her that none of the royal family members were involved. The Queen is in disbelief, but Glen reassured her that he had done a separate investigation on the matter, making him sure of the information. Lysiana thanked him for his efforts, while Carol sneakily praised him. She claimed he did a good job and that they should make their party permanent. However, Glen sneered at the little cat, saying he wouldn't have partied with her if it weren't for the Queen. "Girl, you ain't slick." Lysiana, curious about his strong aversion to Carol, wondered what had caused such hostility between them. Carol, equally curious, admitted she had always wondered the same. Glen's expression darkened as he reminded her of the damage she had done to his reputation. He accused Carol of spreading rumors that had turned people against him. Carol raised her hands in surrender, and then insisted that the rumors had existed long before she even heard them. She explained that she was merely an information gatherer, sharing stories about everything, including Glen's impressive feats, in the bedroom. Carol went on, claiming that she had always praised his strength and his daring nature, recounting his fearless exploits in battle. However, Glen's irritation grew with each word. He buried his face in his palms, recalling how those exploits often included moments he would rather forget. Yet, as Carol passionately defended herself, she insisted it was all true and refused to apologize. Lysiana, observing the exchange, finally stepped in. She gently suggested that Carol made a mistake, which calmed Glen down. He then cleared his throat, reminding everyone to get back on topic. As the conversation shifted, Glen suggested that they get the king on their side. However, Lysiana admitted that such a meeting would be difficult. She was currently forbidden from seeing the king. Freyna suggested that she sneak out to meet him, but it's uncertain if he would still trust her. Meanwhile, Glen is deep in thought, realizing that they have to capture the culprit all at once or they'll escape. Carol, thinking quickly, proposed a bold plan. The only way to secure an audience with the king was for Glen to obtain the prestigious S rank as an adventurer, which would grant him that right. Lysiana agreed with the plan, but expressed doubt about how easily Glen could achieve such a high rank. Carol, however, assured them that it wouldn't take long. In fact, with Glen's skills, it could be done in just a few days. Glen was not too confident with this plan, but he planned to do what was necessary. Determined, Glen left and made his way to the Silver Knights clan headquarters. There, he met with Garius, explaining his urgent need to reach S rank. Garius tried acting nonchalant at first, but he couldn't contain his excitement. He enthusiastically expressed his joy. Now that Glen is finally aiming to reach an S rank, is this dude high or something? While Garius laughed with his bald head, Glen was left worried that his goal would get leaked. If he stood out too much, other people might give him a hard time. Garius, wanting to give his friend the best chance of success, presented him with a little pre-promo gift, a set of equipment made from dragon materials. Glen examined each piece carefully, impressed by the lightweight yet durable craftsmanship. The armor felt almost weightless and fit perfectly, far superior to anything he had ever worn. Glen questioned whether Garius was sure about such a generous gift, knowing how his clan is best known for iron equipments. However, Garius assured him that the best armor is the one that suits the person who wears it. But then, Garius admitted that it did sting a little to know that Glen's armor was now far more impressive than his own. The adventurer felt a wave of embarrassment after hearing such high praise from Garius. However, Garius quickly explained that Glen was a favorite of the local blacksmiths. They considered it an honor to craft a unique outfit for such a renowned adventurer. With a smile, Glen graciously thanked the blacksmiths for their craftsmanship. Without wasting time, Glen headed to Ludger to ask if there were any challenging quests available. Ludger immediately noticed Glen's impressive new gear and quickly found a suitable batch of high-level quests for him. Glen, in his usual ambitious style, decided to accept every single quest available, which scared Garius a little. Garius was skeptical about Glen's eagerness and warned him not to overdo it. He knew Glen's desire to climb the ranks was strong, but attempting to complete so many tasks in one day could be dangerous. Glen, however, brushed off the warning with his usual confidence, promising to finish everything in half a day. Garius was taken aback by his self-assurance and turned to Ludger, asking if Glen was always like this. Ludger remained unfazed, explaining that this was the typical Glen, constantly defying expectations and doing the impossible. Taking on more than 10 assignments at once was nothing new for him, and he would most likely fulfill his promise and complete everything. Garius shook his head in disbelief, wondering if anything about Glen was ever truly normal. At this point, Garius would be too stressed to grow his hair back. For his first quest, Glen was tasked to target a black ogre. But despite the task's high-level difficulty, Glen deemed it too easy. Garius, ever the cautious one, reminded him that he first needed to strategize with his party members. However, Glen remained unfazed, insisting that a simple physical attack would be enough to win. Garius was left dumbfounded, realizing that he made the mistake of expecting anything normal from Glen. Freyna suddenly appeared, gently reminding Glen that he was a bit out of touch with his common sense. She then sarcastically asked if it was normal to cast magic on his own brain, which instantly made Glen more socially aware. Meanwhile, the black ogre was enjoying its meal, making it vulnerable to attack. Seizing the opportunity, Glen moved with lightning speed, stealthily approaching the creature and delivering a fatal blow to its back. The ogre let out a pained squeal, but Glen pressed on until his opponent was completely cut in half. Well, that took long. Checking his list, Glen declared that his next task was to destroy the Death Spear's nest. He was way too focused on his task that he didn't notice Garius being frozen in shock in the background. Just then, Garius screamed that he would always have Glen's back, despite his lack of social awareness. After completing all the assignments, Glen consistently delivered a vast amount of valuable raw materials, all in excellent condition. He explained that he immediately stored the extracted resources in a magical vault to keep them fresh. Ludger was impressed by such achievements and became curious if Garius had assisted Glen in his missions. However, Garius openly admitted that in reality, he could barely keep up with Glen's speed and skills. Curious about his next steps, Glen inquired how many more quests were required to increase his rank. Ludger, taken aback by the question, was surprised at Glen's sudden interest in rank advancement. He reminded Glen of his earlier stance, how he used to avoid pursuing the S rank to avoid drawing too much attention. Reflecting on this, Glen acknowledged the truth in Ludger's reminder. Bro finally has to give up his mysterious aura. Just then, Garius clung to Glen's arms, asking Ludger if his friend could become S rank now. Ludger assured him that Glen was already an experienced adventurer. He also expressed confidence in Glen's performance in the promotion exams. Wasting no time, Ludger left for a moment to inform the master of Glen's interest in boosting his rank. Just then, Garius asked Glen if he told Ludger about the incident, but he said no. Glen had only told Garius about it, believing that it would be a bother to tell the others. Suddenly, Ludger peeped into the door, informing Glen that the guildmaster was summoning him. Shortly after, Glen met Volg Balmunk, the Capital Branch Adventurer Guildmaster. Volg mentioned that it had been long since they last met, but then his attention shifted to Freyna. Having multiple fairy contracts, he was able to see past her invisibility powers. Freyna also confirmed it, whispering to Glen that the little ones must have told Volg about Glen. However, Glen wasn't surprised to know that Volg had been involved with fairies. Just then, Volg mentioned that the atmosphere around Glen had changed as if he had become a different person. Without revealing too much about himself, Glen simply replied that a lot had changed. Just then, he shifted the conversation, focusing on his request for a rank boost. Surprisingly, Volg mentioned that everything had been settled, and that his new adventurer card was being made at that very moment. Glen couldn't believe it, and he asked if there would be no promotion tests. However, Volg had already decided that for someone like Glen, the formal test was unnecessary. Hearing this, Glen smiled and thanked Volg. Meanwhile, Volg merely commented that the young man has changed a lot since they last met. With this, he dismissed Glen, telling him to share a drink with him sometime. Later on, Garius asked for the update, and Glen gladly told him that he had been promoted. As expected from Garius, he loudly congratulated Glen, claiming that he's truly legendary for achieving an S rank on his first attempt at trying. Just then, Ludger appeared, handing Glen his new adventurer card. Glen quickly received it, and he was taken aback by its fine craftsmanship. It was made of orichalcum, a rare material. Ludger explained that such materials were a way to incentivize adventurers, though Glen, ever humble, said magic iron would have sufficed. Just shut up and take it, bro. Meanwhile, Freyna wasn't buying Glen's humble bragging, and she teased him for it. She knew he was actually happy to receive such a rare item. Just then, Glen took a moment to let everything sink in. Finally, a goal of his has been completed, and he can finally meet the king. He asked Ludger when this would be, and the latter replied that it would take place after the report was sent to the royal castle. Garius confirmed it, as he had also received an invitation after 2 days when he first got his card. 3 days later, a promotion celebration party was held in his honor. Glen was relieved to hear this, knowing that all he needed to do was wait. Suddenly, Garius asked Glen if he had any fancy clothes for the party. Glen wondered if Garius knew any good stores, but before he could reply, Alain suddenly appeared. You can smell this guy from a mile away. Glen was less than thrilled to see his old comrade. Meanwhile, Alain remarked that it had been a while and that Glen was hardly recognizable. Glen couldn't resist making a sarcastic remark, replying that he also didn't recognize Alain because of his filthy state. "Okay, who is this diva?" Alain smirked, saying it was sad to hear him say such things when it had been a while since they last saw each other. However, Glen could see past his schemes, and he retorted that it was even sadder that Alain was making amends because he was living in misery. Just then, Freyna bonks Glen's head, reminding him to calm down and put his past grudges behind him. Glen realized Freyna was right, and he admitted that bitter memories had overwhelmed him for a moment. Turning his attention back to the group, Glen noticed an unfamiliar girl on Elaine's team. Sensing something suspicious, he decided to observe her using his appraisal eye. He then asked Alain why he had come to visit now, and if he was attempting to reinstate himself in Glen's good side. Alain admitted the thought had crossed his mind, but in truth, he had brought someone who had long wanted to meet Glen. The strange girl suddenly stepped forward and dramatically accused Glen of taking advantage of her. "Oh shit, here we go again." Then out of nowhere, Glen lunged towards the girl, restraining her to the ground. Alain demanded her immediate release, and so did the rest of his party. However, Glen stood his ground, knowing that the girl was a companion of the Shadow Snake. Ludger reacted quickly, ordering everyone to step back, explaining that the girl was actually a thief. Glen shook his head, remarking how surprised he was that Alain took a criminal within the premises. He asked Alain if he was aware of the girl's crimes, but the man simply walked away with his party, claiming he was clueless. As Alain and his companions left, Glen tasked some of the little fairies to watch over them. Just then, Garius approached Glen, reminding him to give him a heads up whenever he planned to launch an attack. However, Glen merely smirked, saying that Garius needed to sense it. Later, Glen asked Ludger what he had discovered about the thief. However, Ludger revealed that there had been no real conversation yet, as the girl had carried poison and used it on herself. Hearing this, Freyna reassured Glen that the poison hadn't fully taken effect, and the girl was still alive. There was time to question her. Glen was quick to ask Freyna to heal the girl, but they had to do this discreetly to conceal Freyna's existence. Glen then pretended to cast healing magic on the girl, while Freyna did the actual work. Not long after, the girl woke up. Unfazed, Glen grabbed the girl by the collar and coldly demanded to know the location of the Shadow Snake. The girl attempted to protest, claiming she shouldn't have accepted this special request. To silence her dramatic outbursts, he delivered a controlled jolt of magical lightning which quickly subdued her. "There's no negotiating with this guy." Ludger, visibly shaken, asked for a warning next time, as he had never heard anyone scream that much. Later on, they managed to extract the crucial information they needed from the girl. As Ludger had expected, she was just an underling. From the moment the girl came in, they were able to find the Shadow Snake's hideout, all thanks to Glen. Just then, some of the little fairies arrived, informing Glen of something important. Glen informed Ludger that Alain had likely found a new hideout, indicating a deeper involvement than they had initially thought. Ludger asked if Glen planned to infiltrate the hideout right away, but the adventurer advised patience. There were other matters to attend to, possibly connected to the Shadow Snakes, but they required a bit more time. For now, Glen suggested they leave the girl in place, hoping her accomplices might return and reveal more useful information. Meanwhile, Ludger couldn't hide his unease, pointing out that Glen's ruthlessness hasn't changed. He believed that Glen was like this because he was bullied as a kid, making him develop a strong aversion to bad people. Wow, thanks for the free psychoanalysis. Glen didn't even bother denying anything, and he merely said that this was just the way things were. Shifting the topic, Ludger mentioned that he would report to the guildmaster, and then he asked about Glen's plans. Glen replied that he also had to report to someone, and then he tasked Ludger to inform Garius that he had gone back ahead. Poor bald guy always misses the memo. Using magic, Glen teleported to his destination, arriving at the Queen's secret building. He knocked politely before entering, stepping into none other than the Queen's chamber. There he found Carol asking him what was wrong. She wondered what brought him to the premises, as she thought that he would be taking separate actions for a while to become an S-rank adventurer. To her surprise, Glen flashed his S-rank adventurer card, shocking both Carol and Queen Lysiana. However, Glen shrugged off their reactions, informing them that he had important news to share. Alain was furious when he returned to the Shadow Snake's hideout. He stormed in, shouting at the top of his lungs about the thief who had been immediately uncovered and thrown into prison. His loud outburst caught the attention of Mr. Duke, who entered the room, visibly curious about the commotion. Recognizing who was causing the racket, Duke greeted the girls on Alain's team and calmly asked what was going on. Alain didn't waste a second complaining about the failure of their plan involving the thief. Duke, however, flashes a serious look at Alain, telling him to talk to him privately. After listening to Alain's account, Duke briefly hesitated but ultimately concluded that it was unlikely the adventurers had uncovered the hideout's exact location, Elsewhere at the Queen's secret quarters, Lysiana and Carol examined Glen's newly issued S-rank card. They were impressed by how quickly Glen had risen in rank, an achievement accomplished in just a single day. Glen's dedication and hard work had clearly paid off, which only heightened Carol's sense of awe. With Glen now having reached the first phase of their plan, Lysiana confirmed that they could move on to the next one. Glen assured them that the Queen's enemies would soon be eliminated at the party in one fell swoop. He also conveyed Garius's request for reinforcements. The Queen is thankful for his initiative, as finding additional allies at this time would be a significant challenge for her. Glen, already considering solutions, promised to tackle the issue. That night, in the privacy of his room, he found himself deep in thought. Freyna was concerned about his well-being, so Glen finally confessed what was bothering him. He had long hoped his former teammates had been under some kind of magical influence, but the truth was far harsher. They had acted with full awareness. They weren't being manipulated at all. Hearing this, Freyna asked why he didn't just cut ties with his former party, as they didn't really matter anymore. Glen realized that Freyna was right. It's not like he has any fond memories of Alain in the first place. However, it was difficult for him to accept that someone he had known for so long had become a criminal. Sensing that Glen was starting to worry, Freyna urged him to rest and recover for the time being. The next morning, Glen visited Flora to prepare for his visit to the royal castle. He intended to acquire appropriate clothing for the occasion, following Garius's suggestion. Flora was delighted by his success and congratulated him on his well-earned promotion to the S-rank, a status Glen had worked hard to achieve. Glen hoped that his exclusive clothing order would not only meet his needs but also boost trade for Flora's business. Flora was quick to realize the benefits of having such a high-status customer, knowing it would enhance her reputation. With a smile, she promised to personally select the finest materials for Glen. A few days later, Glen received an official invitation to a reception at the royal castle. Immediately, he set out for the palace accompanied by Freyna, marveling at the grandeur of the royal grounds. Unlike their previous visits through hidden passages, this time they entered through the grand front entrance, which impressed Freyna. The guards at the gate greeted Glen with respect, informing him that the king wished to speak with Glen privately. While Glen was sweating bullets, Freyna kept on marveling at the giant doors. I guess teleportation comes with a weird yearning for doors. Just then, Glen followed the guard, eventually leading him to the chambers of King Gravis von der Rhein. The king greeted him warmly, and he apologized for the abruptness of the invitation. Noticing Glen's tension, the king chuckled and reassured him that this was merely an informal conversation. Glen then thanked the king and took a seat, trying to remain composed. However, King Gravis immediately revealed that he was well aware of Glen's association with Queen Lysiana. Well, cat's out of the bag, get the guillotine ready. This admission unsettled Glen, though he maintained a calm exterior. Just then, the king reassured him there was no need to be anxious. He explained that isolating Lysiana had been a strategic move to protect her and ensure she found trustworthy allies. King Gravis clarified that he had never doubted Lysiana's loyalty. He got us in the first half, NGL. At the slightest hint of danger, he had moved her to a more secure location to ensure her safety, knowing that the enemy came from within. He had even planned to hire additional guards for her protection. But these plans had unfortunately been disrupted because of Glen's involvement. The king admitted that he had not expected Glen to take such an active role in protecting the queen and capturing her enemies. Expressing deep gratitude, the king acknowledged Glen's efforts and their importance in resolving the situation. Just then, King Gravis explained that he simply wanted to clear up the entire misunderstanding and return to the peace of his former life. To achieve this, he needed Glen's cooperation. Glen was shocked to hear that the king trusted him, and Gravis confirmed it, explaining that he trusted Lysiana's judgment. With this, Glen shook the king's hand, agreeing to collaborate on exterminating the rebels and return to their daily lives. Glen returned home feeling more relieved than victorious. He worriedly asked Freyna if he said anything stupid, but she reassured him that he was fine. Glen sighed, and he vowed to resolve the incident quickly so that he could relax in a hot spring. Freyna fully supported the idea and even mentioned that the local fairies had told her about a peaceful hot spring they could visit once everything was sorted out. Excited by the suggestion, Glen agreed. He suggested they wrap things up quickly, knowing the hot spring was waiting for them. So when was the last time they bathed? The next big day arrived, the day Glen would be officially introduced as the kingdom's new S-rank adventurer. The royal castle was buzzing with activity, filled with finely dressed aristocrats mingling under glittering chandeliers. Glen stepped into the grand hall, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that many of the conspirators he sought were right here, hiding behind polite smiles and fancy clothes. Freyna, always watchful, leaned in and informed Glen that most of their suspects were participating in the event. As he moved through the hall, Garius suddenly approached him, commenting that he seemed out of place because of his outfit. "Excuse me, Normie, he's wearing Alexander McQueen's medieval collection." Glen smiled as he noticed that Garius had managed to attend the event as a security guard. Garius replied that the king himself had granted him this role and he got it with no sweat. He then silently observed the room, asking if they had to capture most of the nobles. Hearing this, Glen reminded Garius to ensure that his men stayed alert but calm. The crucial moment would come soon, so the entrances must be secured so that no one escapes. With this, Garius bid Glen goodbye, hoping that they would do their best. Not long after, the hall fell into a hush as the king took his seat at the head of the room. With a gesture, he invited everyone to focus on Glen's opening speech. After the brief introduction, Glen stepped forward. He opened with a polite thanks for the warm reception, then he pledged his loyalty to the kingdom's safety and progress. However, Glen's speech came with a twist. Without warning, Glen revealed his first mission, exposing the traitors lurking in plain sight. Gasps rippled through the hall as magical chains burst forth, locking around several nobles. Panic erupted. The captives struggled, but the enchanted bindings held firm. Glen's voice suddenly cut through the chaos as he announced their crimes, claiming that those who were bound in chains were involved in a plot to assassinate the royal family. Well, he really knows how to spice up a party, huh? Meanwhile, Garius wasted no time barking orders to his men to apprehend those who were bound. The guards descended swiftly, surrounding the prisoners to ensure no one escaped. After finishing his mission at the royal castle, Glen asked the king for permission to continue with his duties. With this, Garius thanked him on behalf of the royal family. Before Glen's departure, Garius offered assistance and weapons, but Glen declined, confident that his equipment was more than enough. Without delay, Glen headed to the hideout of the Shadow Snakes. He dealt swiftly with the lower-ranked gang members, silently knocking them out with his powers. Just then, Glen crossed paths with Duke, who immediately recognized him. Glen was surprised that his magic didn't work on Duke, confirming that he was the one running the hideout. Wasting no time, Glen closed the distance and delivered a powerful blow, noting that they could have a nice chat when the man was in jail. Bro's been spitting lines like he's Kendrick. Duke was sent straight to the wall, leaving him alive but immobile. Turning to Freyna, Glen requested that the captured gang members be handed over to Garius. Freyna agreed and asked if he could manage the rest alone. Glen assured her he could, and then he went on his way, saying that it was time for him to settle things from the past. Meanwhile, Alain and his team are desperately trying to leave the city. Emily begged him to slow down, but Alain was determined to escape Glen's clutches. Just then, Glen appeared out of nowhere, asking who Alain was running away from. Seeing his nemesis before him, Alain froze in shock, unsure how to react. Glen then asked where they were headed in the middle of the night, and Alain made an unconvincing alibi. He stammered that they were going to the location of a new job. However, Glen called out his lie. He knew Alain ran away because he couldn't handle his current dilemma with his usual smooth talking. This is why Alain scheduled his escape on the day when Glen would be at the castle. Glen reminded Alain how skilled he had once been at manipulation, even as a child, but age seemed to have dulled those talents. Just then, Emily interrupted their confrontation, demanding Glen leave them alone. The other girls chimed in while another asked if he was willing to join them again. However, Glen simply sighed, clarifying that he had no intention of reconciling their alliance. His only goal was to deal with those who had betrayed him and strayed into crime. Alain suddenly drew his sword, claiming that he didn't know anything and that Glen was talking nonsense. Glen, unimpressed, calmly pointed out that while he hadn't witnessed every event, he had gathered enough evidence to expose their actions. And the sword Alain was holding, it wasn't his. The real owner had been deceived and robbed, possibly dead. Panic flickered in Alain's eyes. Realizing he was trapped, he made a desperate attack. Glen, with reflexes far sharper than Alain expected, easily deflected the strike. The rest of Alain's party tried to help him, but Glen used his power to send them flying. Alain, lying on the ground, lashed out wildly and said that he was tired of Glen interfering with his life. He was furious that Emily fell in love with Glen. Even as kids, Glen was always smarter and stronger than him. Meanwhile, Glen wasn't buying his stupid little sob story, and he coldly said that Alain's jealousy was unsightly. Just then, Glen placed the tip of his blade before Alain's neck, making him plead for his life. However, Glen knew that Alain didn't regret his crimes, and he didn't even look like he was going to apologize. He then grabbed Alain by the collar and looked at him dead in the eyes, telling him he was nothing. Dude waited for his revenge arc and went all out. With a calculated strike of lightning magic, Glen incapacitated Alain, leaving him unconscious but alive. He refused to dirty his hands further. Alain had already proven he was no longer worth the effort. Although he hated the man, the lightning magic he used on him was weaker than the one he used to do to himself. Later on, Alain and his team were bound in chains. Garius immediately asked Glen if he was alright, and he honestly replied that he wasn't since he was extremely tired. With that, he left the rest of the task to Garius, who happily accepted the task. Just then, Freyna greeted Glen warmly upon his return, immediately wrapping him in a comforting embrace. Glen basked in the warmth of her comfort. Then he apologized for making her worry. The next day, word of the betrayal spread quickly across the capital. The townspeople whispered about the corruption within the aristocracy and Glen's role in exposing it. His actions had saved the kingdom from a deeper conspiracy, earning him widespread admiration. Meanwhile, Carol peeped into Glen's room asking if he was ready. He was expected to attend the king's formal acknowledgment for him, as he saved the entire kingdom. Sensing that he was a bit tense, Freyna tried teasing Glen to help lighten the mood. With a smile, he said he was going to wrap up this task so they could head to the hot spring. Later on, Glen and Freyna found themselves in the royal palace, surrounded by the royal family and a few nobles. King Garius, accompanied by Queen Lysiana, personally thanked Glen for his efforts in solving the crime. The adventurer expressed his relief to see the king and queen safe and well. Soon after, it was time for the reward, which was presented not only to Glen but also to Freyna. Once the formalities were over, Glen suggested they head to the baths together for a well-earned rest. However, before they could leave, a guard interrupted, informing Glen that the king wished to speak to him once more in a more private setting. Glen politely declined the escort, assuring them he could find his own way. Freyna, however, was less amused by the delays. Darn, nobody said this job had overtime. Eventually, Glen and Freyna made their way to the magnificent springs just outside the city. Freyna was in awe of the serene beauty of the place, commenting on how she could still hear echoes of the citizens' gratitude to Glen. Just then, Glen reminded her that the success was a result of a team effort, and that it didn't feel right to take all the credit alone. Freyna agreed, but reassured him that there was no harm in being recognized for his role. As they soaked in the soothing waters, Freyna admitted that the hot springs in the human world seemed better than the ones from the fairy realm. Glen agreed, and he was glad they followed the recommendations of the little fairies, who also got the good news from a hot spring-loving adventurer. The adventurer was known to go on journeys to find hidden hot springs. Weird hobby, but okay. Feeling the warmth of the spring, Glen and Freyna closed their eyes in relaxation, exclaiming that this is heaven. Upon his return to the capital, Glen unexpectedly crossed paths with Flora. Surprised but delighted, he admitted that he had planned to visit her after finding suitable accommodations. Flora, however, had something else in mind. Holding up a set of keys, she announced that she had a special gift for him. Without giving Glen time to process what was happening, she took his hand and led him through the bustling streets. Third party coming through. After a brief walk, they arrived at a grand estate. Flora casually mentioned that the entire property now belonged to him. Glen stood in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the mansion before him. When he finally found his voice, he asked why he would ever need such an enormous house. Flora explained with a playful grin that a top-tier adventurer needed a residence that matched his rank and reputation. Curious, Glen asked how she had managed to prepare such an extravagant gift in the short time he had been away. Flora revealed that it was all thanks to a secret rapid construction technique mastered by her company, which left Glen thoroughly amazed. The moment Glen stepped inside, he was greeted by an opulent interior that exceeded all his expectations. The spacious halls and luxurious details left him speechless. Freyna was particularly captivated by the grand bathtub, already envisioning a relaxing soak with Glen in the near future. Homegirls got her priorities straight. Flora beamed with satisfaction, happy to see Glen's genuine delight. Glen, still in awe, asked how much the construction had cost, offering to reimburse her with the reward money he had received from the king. However, Flora gently waved off his offer, explaining that her financial resources were part of her company's secrets, so there was no need for him to worry. She was just glad that he came back safe and sound, and there weren't even any bad rumors about him. With a smile, she told Glen to think of her favor as a celebratory gift. Touched by her kindness and generosity, Glen sincerely thanked Flora for everything she had done for him. Just then, Freyna immediately suggested organizing a party, inviting everyone from the Silver Knights clan. She explained that it would be a great way to celebrate and help everyone connect in a relaxed, festive environment. Flora eagerly supported the idea, offering to take charge of sending out invitations. Glen found himself warming to the idea as well. After all, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to celebrate his victory. Later that day, Glen decided to visit Garius to share the latest updates. When he arrived, Glen noticed an enormous stack of papers on Garius's desk. Curious, he asked what they were about, and with a tired sigh, Garius suggested looking at them to find out. To Glen's surprise, the documents turned out to be a flood of job offers and contract proposals addressed to him. Some were from prestigious organizations, while others came from individuals who had even shown up in person to negotiate directly. Glen was taken aback by the sheer volume of offers, and he apologized to Garius for the hassle he caused. Celebrity problems, am I right? Just then, Garius flashed a serious look, asking Glen for his plans. He also reassured him that he had the freedom to transfer parties or work independently. For a moment, Glen reflected on the situation. It made sense that his successes had drawn interest from all corners. Still, he turned to his friend with a determined expression. Without hesitation, Glen firmly declared that he wanted to officially join the Silver Knights. In a split second, Garius's nonchalant demeanor disappeared, and he welcomed Glen with a tight hug. To celebrate, Glen invited Garius and the entire Silver Knights clan to a party at his new mansion. Surprised, Garius raised an eyebrow in surprise and asked if Glen had recently purchased a house. Glen laughed and explained that he just got it out of nowhere. When Garius expressed concern about space, mentioning that his clan had over 50 members, Glen assured him that there would be plenty of room for everyone. The mention of such a large house left Garius imagining just how massive the place must be. Little does he know it's way bigger than the space on his bald head. Later, Glen invited Ludger, who was equally taken aback by the size of the mansion. Ludger handed Glen a thoughtfully prepared gift and asked if Glen had managed to rest after his recent adventures. In response, Glen spoke of a peaceful hot spring retreat that had been recommended to him by a spring-loving adventurer. Ludger guessed that the recommendation must have come from Fred, a well-known hot spring enthusiast who was listed in the Adventurers Guild, and also a member of the Garius' Silver Knights clan. Glen paused to think, and admitted that he had never seen Fred with Garius before, nor did he know Fred was a member of the clan. Ludger explained that Fred was constantly on the hunt for new hot springs, which kept him away from the capital most of the time. Even now, no one knew exactly where Fred was traveling. Glen nodded in response, but his mind was occupied by something else. That damn cat is lurking near him. As expected, Carol appeared at the window, eager to pounce. However, Glen was quick to react, and he punished Carol for creeping up on him. He then asked Carol why she had come, and she explained that she had come to visit him since he was back. She expected him to come to see her after their previous mission. But Glen bluntly replied that no one would ever come to her place. With a frown, Carol called him out for his hurtful words. Having heard Fred's name, Carol informed Glen that he was at the royal palace. Glen pressed for more details, wondering what Fred could possibly be doing there. Carol explained that since the king and queen were traveling, Fred was advising them on the best hot spring locations. Ludger then added that King Gravis and Queen Lysiana were likely taking a well-deserved vacation now that peace had been restored, all thanks to Glen. Not one to be left out, Carol reminded them that she also deserved credit for their success. That evening, Garius and his entire clan arrived at Glen's mansion. The leader of the Silver Knights clan was visibly impressed by the grandeur of Glen's new home. True to his word, Garius had brought every member of his clan, filling the mansion with a lively and celebratory atmosphere. Among the guests was Rick, who had a deep admiration for Glen. She had brought him a bouquet of flowers as a token of gratitude for the invitation. Just then, Garius appeared and revealed that Rick was a big fan of Glen, and he was also the reason why she joined the clan in the first place. Embarrassed, Rick tells Garius not to reveal her secrets. Hearing this, Glen asked the little girl if she had heard of him for that long. Rick answered that her home village had once been threatened by a vicious monster attack, but it was Glen who had arrived in time to kill it. What had been a standard mission for Glen became a life-altering event for Rick and her family. From that moment, Rick moved to the capital to join the Silver Knights, thinking of Glen as her hero. Garius smiled at the little girl's story, and he added that she was the only one who didn't believe in the rumors surrounding Glen. Glen smiled, thanking Rick for her kind words. However, their genuine moment was interrupted by a party pooper, who is none other than Carol. She burst through the crowd of guests with frantic urgency, claiming that she had important business with Glen. Annoyed, Glen quickly turned his back on her, telling her that she wasn't even invited to the event. Furious, Carol called him out for being mean, and she explained that it was not the time for it. Just then, she whispered to Glen that some of the criminals they captured at the palace had disappeared. The revelation shocked Glen. He was sure that they investigated the prison and the soldiers together, leaving them no clue as to who let the prisoners out. Carol thought the same thing, but it couldn't be denied that some individuals really disappeared. She then mentioned that Alain was one of the missing ones, making Glen even more concerned. Without wasting any time, Glen turned to Flora and Ludger, entrusting them with the responsibility of looking after the party in his absence. Both assured him that they would manage everything and encouraged him to take care of the crisis at hand. Channeling his magic, he teleported directly to the prison. There he noticed that only Alain was missing, but his female members were complete. The girls desperately called for Glen, but he mercilessly left them in their cells. Damn, this guy really holds grudges. Glen then turned to Freyna, asking her if there were still traces of Alain's magic powers in the vicinity. Freyna carefully surveyed the area, and she detected a faint trace of high-level spatial magic. Glen wondered if it was teleportation, but it was impossible since the prisoners were bound by magic-sealing shackles. Even the cells had special barriers, which should have made escape impossible. If it was the magic of something non-human, teleportation would have been possible. Hearing this, Freyna suspected that it was most likely the work of a demon. That is the end of the recap at Chapter 11. Please read the pinned comment about the next part.